When the Calloway family finally sold the old home place in Harrow Bend, Tennessee, in 2019, the last of the old generation gone, the house emptied for the buyers. The contractor pulling up the warped pine floor of the back bedroom found, in the crawl space beneath, wrapped in an old quilt the family would recognize, the remains of a woman who had been declared a runaway 44 years before. Her name was Lorene Calloway, and she had not run away from her husband and children in 1975, the way the family had told itself and the town for 44 years. She had been beneath the floorboards of the family home the entire time, and the truth of how she got there would destroy what was left of the family that had lived above her. That is not a story about a wife and mother who walked out. That is a story about a murder hidden inside a family's own home and its own story for 44 years, and the terrible cost of the truth when it finally came up through the floor. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the Tennessee Hill Country in the summer of 1975, and to the woman her family said had left them. Harrow Bend in 1975 was a small town in the hills of Middle Tennessee, tobacco and hardwood ridges, a Baptist church, and a feed store. A few hundred people who knew one another's business, or thought they did. It was a place where family was everything, and family trouble stayed inside the family, behind closed doors, not spoken of, where a household could carry a secret for a long time because nobody outside it would presume to ask. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew the Calloways out on the Ridge Road, and knew that Lorene Calloway had a hard marriage. Lorene Calloway was 36, a wife and the mother of 3, married to Roy Calloway, a hard man with a hard hand, in a marriage the whole town half knew was troubled and no one talked about. She was, by the accounts of the few who knew her well, a warm and worn-down woman who lived for her children and endured the rest. She kept a garden, sang in the church choir when Roy let her go, and was loved by her kids, with the fierce protectiveness children develop in a frightened house. And Lorene had one thing that was hers, a quilt her own mother had made her, a wedding quilt in a wedding ring pattern, the one beautiful thing she owned that she kept folded on the bed and would wrap around the children when there was shouting in the house. That quilt would be the thing that named her 44 years later. In the summer of 1975, Lorene Calloway disappeared from the Ridge Road, and her family said she had run off, and the town believed it because it was the easiest thing to believe about a woman in a hard marriage. Here is the story the family told, and how readily Harrow Bend accepted it. Roy Calloway told the neighbors, and then the sheriff, that Lorene had run off, left him and the children, gone in the night the way an unhappy woman in a hard marriage might. It was a shameful story in that time and place, a mother abandoning her children. But it was a believable one, because everyone knew the marriage was bad, and a woman fleeing a bad marriage was a thing that happened. The sheriff, a man disinclined to pry into a family's private misery, took the report and did little. There was no body, no sign of foul play that anyone looked for, and a grown woman leaving her husband was not, in 1975, a matter the law chased hard. Within weeks it was settled. Lorene Calloway had abandoned her family. The children were left to grow up under that. The mother who left them. And the town clucked its tongue and moved on. No one searched. No one asked the question that should have been asked of a hard man whose wife had vanished. The detail that should have screamed was the children and the quilt. Lorene Calloway lived for her 3 children. The people who truly knew her could not square the woman they knew with a mother who'd abandoned them without a word, and never once come back for them or contact them in all the years after. And she would never have left her mother's wedding quilt, the one beautiful thing she owned. But the runaway story was shameful enough that no one wanted to examine it closely, and a hard marriage made a fleeing wife plausible, and so the impossible, that a devoted mother simply vanished from her children's lives forever, was accepted because the alternative was unthinkable in a different way. The people who never accepted it were the children themselves, and one of them most of all, the middle child, a daughter named Janie, who'd been 10 in 1975. Janie knew her mother loved them, knew her mother would never have left them with Roy, of all things, would never have left them at all. She said so as a child and as she grew, and was hushed, and told her mother had been weak and selfish and gone, and carried into her adult life a grief and a doubt that warred with each other. The town's story that her mother abandoned her, and her own bone-deep knowledge that her mother never would have. That war lived in Janie for 44 years. The institutional failure here was the privacy of family violence, the way a hard marriage and a shameful runaway story let a household's worst secret stay sealed inside it, because the law and the town alike were reluctant to pry into family business, and because a battered woman fleeing was a story sad enough and common enough to close the question. No one investigated Roy Calloway, the obvious suspect, when a man's wife vanishes, because the family supplied the story and the town accepted it, and the children's certainty was dismissed as a child's wishful grief. Lorene Calloway's killer hid behind the closed door of the family home and the silence that surrounded it. Then the case went cold beneath the floor, in the house where the family went on living. The children grew up in that house with their father, above their mother, never knowing. Roy Calloway lived out his life there, hard and silent, and died in the 1990s, taking what everyone assumed was simple grief or guilt over an abandonment to his grave. The house passed to the children, then was rented, then sat, the family scattering, the old home place becoming a thing to eventually be sold. And under the pine floor of the back bedroom, wrapped in a wedding quilt, Lorene Calloway waited. By 1985, 10 years had passed. The Calloway children were growing up motherless, marked as the kids whose mama ran off. Janie carried her doubt. Roy carried his silence. The case, such as it was, did not exist. There was nothing to be cold, only a woman who'd left. By 2010, Roy Calloway was years dead. The children were middle-aged, the old home place standing empty on the Ridge Road, a thing the surviving siblings would someday have to deal with. Janie, now in her 40s, had never resolved the war inside her, half believing the town, half knowing better, never able to prove which. There was no case to reopen, no evidence to test, only an old shame and an old absence. And then the family decided to sell the home place, and a buyer wanted the old floors redone. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the lives of people who deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep telling these stories the way they ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly is what keeps this channel going. Now, let's get back to Lorene. The 44-year silence ended when the floor came up. In 2019, with the home place finally sold, a contractor pulling up the warped old pine floor of the back bedroom found, in the crawl space beneath, human remains wrapped in a quilt, a wedding ring pattern quilt, faded and rotted, but its pattern still readable. He called the sheriff, and when the family was contacted, it was Janie who knew, before anyone confirmed anything, whose quilt that was. Her mother's wedding quilt, her grandmother's handiwork, the one beautiful thing Lorene Calloway owned, the quilt she'd wrapped her frightened children in. Her mother had not run away. Her mother had been under the floor of the house Janie grew up in the whole time. Here is the truth of how this case broke, and there was no technology in the finding of it. Only an old floor pulled up, and a quilt a daughter recognized. Forensic examination, supported by the quilt, and confirmed by DNA from the surviving children, established that the Rangs were Lorene Calloway, and that she had been killed. Not a woman who lay down beneath her own floor, but a homicide concealed. A body under the family floor, wrapped in the family quilt, meant the killer was family, meant the runaway story had been a lie told by the people inside that house. And the evidence and the long-buried truth pointed where it had always pointed, and no one had looked. At Roy Calloway, the hard-handed husband, dead now for over 20 years. The reconstruction was grimly clear. Roy had killed Lorene in the home in 1975. In that marriage everyone half knew was violent, and had buried her beneath the floorboards of the back bedroom and told his children and his town that she'd run off. And then raised those children in the house above their mother's body, let them grow up believing she'd abandoned them, and carried it to his grave. But here is where the truth did the thing the title names, where it destroyed the family. Because Roy Calloway being dead was not the end of it. The investigation, in establishing how Lorene died and how she was concealed, uncovered something the surviving siblings had never known and could not have borne to imagine. That Roy had not been alone in the house that night, and that the concealment, the careful burial beneath the floor, had required help. And the help, the evidence indicated, and a surviving family member, ultimately, shatteringly acknowledged, had come from within the family in the aftermath. An older relative who had known, that night or soon after, what Roy had done, and had helped hide it, and had kept the secret, and had let the children grow up believing their mother abandoned them rather than reveal that she'd been murdered and concealed by their father with a family member's knowing help. The truth that came up through the floor was not only that Roy killed Lorene. It was that someone the children had loved and trusted their whole lives had known where their mother was all along and let them grieve a lie. When it came out, it did exactly what the title says. It destroyed the family. There was no clean villain to arrest and move past. Roy was dead, and the living person who had helped conceal the truth was old now, and the revelation tore the surviving siblings apart, between those who could not forgive the decades of lie and those who could not bear to condemn an aging relative for a terrified choice made in 1975. The family that had survived, more or less, on the story that their mother left them, could not survive the truth that she never did, that she'd been beneath their feet, and that the lie had been kept by their own. Some bonds broke that no verdict could mend. There was no triumphant arrest here. No killer led away in cuffs to satisfying applause. Roy Calloway had escaped earthly justice by dying decades before. What there was, instead, was the truth, finally, and a mother brought up out of the floor of her own home. Lorene Calloway's status was corrected, after 44 years, from a runaway mother to a murder victim. Her name cleared of the abandonment that had been hung on it, and that her children had carried, as a wound, their whole lives. She was buried properly at last, beside her own mother, wrapped. The family agreed on this much, in a new quilt, since the old one was evidence and ruin both. And Janie, the daughter who'd known since she was 10 that her mother would never have left them, was right. Finally, and terribly right at the cost of everything the lie had been protecting. Lorene Calloway was 36 years old. She lived for her 3 children, kept a garden, sang in the choir when she was allowed, and wrapped her kids in her mother's wedding quilt when the house turned frightening. She did not abandon her children. She was murdered by her husband in their home and hidden beneath the floorboards, and her children were raised above her body and taught to believe she'd left them. A lie kept, in the end, not only by the man who killed her, but by family who knew. There was no detective who cracked this and no stranger to blame. There was a floor pulled up, a quilt recognized, and a truth that freed a dead woman's name and destroyed the living family that had been built on the lie. It makes you wonder. How many women in hard marriages, in eras that looked away from family violence, were declared runaways when they'd been killed at home? The runaway story, a shame the town would accept, rather than a crime it would investigate. How many secrets have been kept not by killers alone, but by the families around them? The silence passed down with the house. And what does the truth cost when it comes this late? When it frees the dead but shatters the living who built their lives on the lie? Tell us in the comments. Do you think the family member who helped conceal it bears the same guilt as the killer? Or do you understand a terrified choice made in 1975? What stayed with you most? The quilt, the children raised above their mother, the lie kept for 44 years, and how many she ran off and left her family stories. From that era, do you believe were never that at all? Justice, of a hard and incomplete kind, came for Lorene Calloway after 44 years, not an arrest, for her killer was long dead, but the truth come up through the floor of her own home. Stories like hers remind us that the runaway story has hidden many a murder behind a closed family door, that a lie can be kept for a lifetime by the people we trust most, and that even a truth that destroys is still owed to the dead and is its own hard form of justice. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.